Hello, hello, hello. Hope you enjoy the end of February. Let's get started. Chapter 9 An Anomic Plague. To Derek's dismay, Ariel did not reappear that afternoon, and the next morning she arose late and looked terrible. Our David became alarmed. "Miss Avery, are you not well? What are your symptoms?" "The same as usual, our David. Don't worry. I brought this illness with me. It's nothing to worry about." She sounded tired and fretful, trying not to worry his three-law dominated brain. But a robot will worry if it seems appropriate, whether told not to or not. They weren't so different from humans in that respect, thought Derek, himself alarmed. "I hope you are indeed not seriously ill, Miss Avery, but please tell me your symptoms that I may judge. As you know, first law compels me to help you." She grimaced. "Okay, I'm frequently feverish. Is there any water in this place?" "No," Derek said. "I'll bring you Frost. Is there anything to carry water in?" "No," said our David. Mentally, Derek cursed all Earthers, individually and collectively, and in the term-min relationship, too. "Anyway, I'm often feverish and tired and lethargic and listless and she glanced at Derek. "I have mental troubles, confusion. I forget where I am, lose track of what's going on. A lot of time I sit and don't speak because I can't follow the conversation. I've been reliving the past a lot." Suddenly she cried out passionately, "Nothing seems real. I feel like I'm in a hallucination." It was more serious than Derek had thought. Hesitantly he asked, "Do you feel like going to the section kitchen?" "No, I don't feel like doing anything, except drinking a liter of water and going back to bed." "You must go to the section hospital at once," said our David, decisively stepping forward. Derek could have groaned. "What kind of medical care do you expect in an earthly hospital?" he asked. "We've got to get you back to the spacer worlds." "There's no cure for me there," she said quietly. Damn, that was true. Derek hesitated, torn, and said, "Well, back to Robot City, then. Maybe the human medical team has a cure." "My medical knowledge is limited, primarily to the effects of earthly ills on the spacers, but that knowledge makes me doubt that Miss Avery will live long enough for a space journey," said our David, the catch in his voice obvious. "She is obviously in, or approaching, the crisis of her disease." Derek hesitated. That, too, obviously true. Ariel smiled sadly and said, "I fear he is right, Derek. I'm losing my memory, my mind. And it's getting worse. I couldn't remember my way back here the other night." Abruptly she was weeping. "Oh, Frost," Derek thought helplessly. Our David gave them an argument. He wanted to accompany them, to carry Ariel, in fact. "No," said Derek. "I may be ignorant of many things about Earth, but I know well enough what Earthers do to any robots they capture on their ways. And if you try to do anything about it, our first words would give us away as spacers. They'd be all over us. I've been chased once by yeast farmers. Frost, I don't want to have every Earther we meet at our throats." It took the firmest commands reinforcing Dr. Avery's to keep our David in the apartment. Only when Ariel pricked up as she usually did at the prospect of change was the robot's first law condition allayed. Ariel was even almost gay as she left, rendering a zany marching song. "1, 2, 3, here we go, Bedlam, Bedlam, ho, ho, ho. Dring, dring, brum, brum, bree, dee, dabba, da, da, bum, bum." But once the door had closed, she looked haggard. "Water," she said, smiling wanly at Derek's concerned look. After she had drunk a liter or so, she gasped for breath a few minutes, but was game to go on. The route to the section hospital was longer than the one to the kitchen, and she drooped visibly. Worse, it was morning now, and the express was jammed. They had to stand. Threes weren't allowed to sit during rush hour. It seemed that the nightmare of rushing ways and whistling wind and unconcerned, self-centered Earthers would go on forever. Derek had to watch Ariel. He feared she would collapse, and also watched the signs overhead, fearing that he would forget or confuse the instructions he had carefully impressed on his memory. But even the longest journey ends at last, and the exit was clearly marked Section Hospital, with the same red cross on white that spacers used. The anteroom smelled of antiseptic and was mobbed with men, women, and children. Children, thought Derek vaguely. Never seen so many children in my life as on Earth. Though his memories were still lost, he was sure, by his astonished reaction, that he had not. Of course, they had to keep replacing this huge population. Fumbling, he inserted Ariel's newly forged ID tags into the computer, whose panel lit up with "Checkup, Illness, Emergency." Ariel was leaning against him, gasping and pale after the ordeal, and even the usually unconcerned Earthers were looking at them in some alarm. Emergency, he decided, panicky, and punched it. Instantly a red star appeared in the panel, blinking. Apparently alarms rang elsewhere, for a strong-looking woman appeared, started to remonstrate him for mistaking an illness for an emergency. Young husbands! But Ariel turned a ghostly, apologetic smile on her, and the woman's mouth closed with a snap. Here. She half carried Ariel past 3 rooms full of still more waiting Earthers, to a room with a wheeled, knee-high cart in it. Lie down, baby. The gurney stood up. She strapped Ariel on, and an older woman entered. Dr. Lee. I see. She began to check over Ariel, not bothering with instruments. She took Ariel's temperature by placing her hand on Ariel's head. A harassed-looking man entered. He wore a curious ornament in the form of a frame holding glass panes in front of his eyes. Derek had noticed some of these on the ways. It gave his face a dashing, futuristic look. What is it, Dr. Lee? I don't know yet, Dr. Powell. Elevated temperatures, febrile heartbeat, heretic flash exhaustion. I want to measure everything, of course. She reached to the bottom of the gurney and started pulling out instruments, to Derek's considerable relief. Ariel had closed her eyes and seemed to be asleep. The doctors bent over her, shaking their heads and measuring everything about Ariel. Tense as he was, Derek looked about for a place to sit, content for the moment to leave it in their hands. Abruptly the nurse said, "How long has it been since she's eaten?" The doctors ignored this until Derek said, Yesterday afternoon, not long after noon." Dr. Lee grunted, and Dr. Powell said, "Inanition. Young as she is, that shouldn't have brought on this collapse. Feel that arm. She's practically starving." The 3 of them looked at each other, plainly shocked. "Why hasn't she been eating, young man?" Dr. Lee demanded. "She hasn't felt like it, ma'am," said Derek, and the 3 of them frowned at his accent. "Settler prospects, eh?" Powell removed his frame and wiped the panes with a tissue. "You'll not have much need of spacer talk on a frontier planet. Better learn some good medieval jargon. Brush, creek, log cabin. Not to mention sweat. What's wrong with her?" "I don't know, doctor. She said," he gulped, "it could be fatal if it crossed the blood-brain barrier. It's affecting her mind. She's had this low-level fever and lethargy with occasional muscle aches and pains for a long time." "Vomiting? Night sweats?" asked Dr. Lee tersely. "I don't know. She didn't want to worry me." They looked outraged. He should know. "There's a number of things it could be," said Dr. Lee unhappily. "I have a few ideas, though." "So do I," said Dr. Power sourly. "Look here, young fella, I don't doubt that accent caused you many a pain, but you'd better duff it in here. It antagonizes too many people." "He can't," said Dr. Lee expressionlessly. "He's a real spacer." Dr. Powell and the nurse goggled. "Impossible! A spacer running around on Earth? He's dropped down dead of—" The doctors whirled to look at Ariel. Frowning, the nurse stepped out. "It could be any number of 100 common and harmless diseases," said Dr. Power. "Yes, harmless to Earth people. How about you yourself, young man? Do you feel all right?" Derek nodded. "Never better." "Why, then," Dr. Powell exploded, "you should be sick a dozen times over." "I've been given a prophylactic regimen. So has Ariel," said Derek, hoping they wouldn't ask too many questions. "I don't know too much about it." "Apparently it didn't take in her case," said Dr. Lee somberly. "You let us know the moment you feel unwell, young man." "They can't be spacers," said the nurse grimly, holding Ariel's ID in her tag. "How could they be, and travel around Earth without ration card ID and so on? This is perfectly ordinary Earth ID, City of St. Louis." They looked at him, frowning harder, and Derek felt himself hot, not to mention sweating. That's all arranged, sir. It's part of a trade agreement. We're doing sociological research. So young? Who notices a kid? He countered swiftly, feeling the hair clammy against his forehead. Young eyes see more sharply, and so on. Humph! No child of mine would take such a risk. Maybe we better query the Terrys, said Dr. Lee reluctantly. They all looked concerned. Derek questioned them with his eyes, but finally had to break down and ask, "The who?" "The Terrys, Terrestrial Bureau of Investigation," said Dr. Powell. He polished his panes unhappily. "They cause more trouble than—" muttered the nurse. "Still, best to take no chances. If the girl's in a bad way, could cause troubles with the Spacers. That's bad enough blood between us already." Derek thought swiftly, appalled. The Terrys would find no record of them, would query whatever Spacer representation there might be on Earth, find no record there, and the reactor would flash over. But he couldn't think of a thing to say. "Look." Ariel moaned and turned partly on her side. Only the straps kept her from falling. If she'd been listening, she couldn't have timed it better. All three Earthers leapt to her, and Derek pocketed the ID tag the nurse had put down. He thought quickly. The doctors were concerned and totally focused on Ariel. Derek looked around. As he recalled our David's work, the ID tag merely gave name and ID workup, not address. Medical care was on an as-needed basis, not rationed, so nobody cared about place of residence, and in fact they hadn't been required to enter that. Or was that because Ariel's tag gave her rating as transient? You need to know a lot more about Earth. In any case, he thought, the only thing they knew about Ariel was what the computer recorded from the ID tag. Leaving them working over her, he slipped out and strolled around, speaking to no one, trying to look like a worried, expectant father, pretending to be nonchalant. A couple of people looked at him sympathetically, but most didn't seem to notice him at all, for which he was grateful. There it was, an office. He slipped in, looking at the terminal. It was probably dedicated to a single function, but he could try. He had watched our David coding ID tags of dozens kinds, and had a good grasp of what was implied. And frankly, these computers were simple after programming postronic brains and restructuring the programming of the central computer robot city. It took him a mere half-hour to get through the programming, retrieve the record on Ariel, and erase it. Now let's hope there isn't backup memory somewhere, he thought gloomily. They caught up with him in the interior waiting room, standing aimlessly about, and unobtrusively slipping toward the outer waiting room, where he supposed he belonged. "There you are," said the nurse. For the first time he noted that her jacket had a name label printed on it. Korolenko. J. "Why didn't you wait in the Friends' Lounge?" He didn't bother to tell her that they hadn't shown it to him. "I had to go to the personal," he said, not knowing if Earthers could mention the personal so openly. She got ideas, frowned, put something warm from her pocket against his head. "Apparently his temperature's all right." "Very well, but come in here. The doctors will need to speak to you." Within 10 minutes Dr. Lee entered the room briskly, sat down, exhaled heavily. "She had us worried, but it was mostly exhaustion of the body's resources. Starvation, to put it crudely. She must have been going on nerves and caffeine for weeks." "She hasn't been eating well," Derek admitted. He had been blind not to see how little she'd been eating. "What does she have?" "We'll know for sure in a day. We've done a culture, but our best guess is mnemonic plague. Mnemonic? From medieval mnemonic, meaning memory. Mnemonic means no memory. It's a mutation of an old influenza virus, first reported in one of the settled worlds, sometimes called Burundi's fever, after the discoverer." She looked at him sharply, but clearly that name meant no more to Derek than the first. "Will she get better?" Dr. Lee sighed. "When Burundi's crosses the blood-brain barrier, it isn't good. We're giving her support, nourishment, and so on, and antibiotics will eventually cure the disease. Our antivirals are fairly effective, except where the virus has crossed the blood-brain barrier. Antibodies will help a little, and we're administrating them. We'll be able to stop the infection in all but her brain within a day or two." Derek had the impression that his chest had turned into a block of wood. His heart pushed once, hard against its unyielding surroundings, and gave up. He felt it stop moving. "Her brain?" Dr. Lee sighed and looked 400 years old. "There's no hope. It's by no means over. I do wish we'd gotten at her sooner. I'll try not to feel guilty. I'm sorry if I made you feel worse. You couldn't have known. All kids are heedless, think they'll live forever." She brooded on her capable hands for a moment. "Then you think she'll live?" "I say there's good hope of it. Dr. Morven is a specialist on viruses and has treated an pneumonic plague 3 times, twice successfully, and the third time was a patient whose disease had advanced much farther than your wife's." Derek suspected that the symptoms of the other two had been much less advanced than Ariel's, but said nothing. It was something, he acknowledged, that they knew the disease, had a cure for it, and had hope for her. Of course, he thought, we were fools, chauvinistic fools, to assume that the spacer worlds were the only ones who knew anything about medicine. Who but Earth, incubator of virtually every disease known to mankind, would know more about medicine? Among the spacer worlds, he supposed, any pneumonic plague was invariably fatal when it crossed the blood-brain barrier. Derek felt his knees shaking, and was glad he wasn't standing. "What?" He missed some of what she'd been saying. "Need a sample," she repeated. "We can't give you the vaccine if you have the disease, at least in its later stages." The key to perihelion affected the stomach like this, a sudden drop as one went from gravity to free fall instantly. Derek nearly threw up. Gulping, he said, "Yes, ma'am," and held out his arm. Disease. The possibility had always been there, associating with Ariel, but it was obvious that what she had wasn't easily contagious. She had only mentioned once, more or less directly, how she had contracted her illness, as a warning to him, but that was the only time they had come close to more than accidental physical contact. Now that he thought about it, she had kept her distance, even when she had clearly wanted and needed to be hugged. His spacer's horror of disease had not been as greatly allayed as he'd thought, he realized shakily. The prophylactic treatment our David had been giving them had reassured him. Ariel's attitude and his worry over her had reassured him, and the heedlessness of youth. His eyes must have mirrored some of his horror, for Dr. Lee looked at him sharply and said, "Don't worry. You're obviously in a very early stage, if you have it at all, and we're going to give you a very thorough going over to make sure you aren't coming down with something else." They did that for the next half hour. The human medical team would have been faster, but no less thorough, he thought. "Good. You're totally free of disease, so far as we can tell," said Dr. Powell. "Fortunately, your intestinal microorganisms are not markedly different from the terrestrial strains, and there's nothing, as yet, nothing else to worry about. Dr. Lee, the vaccine. Incidentally, we've detected antitoxins to Burundi's in your system," said Dr. Lee. "You may have had a mild case of the fever earlier. It may even still be latent in your system. However, the vaccine will immunize you totally." Said Derek as a thought took him. "Have I been a carrier all this time?" Uneasily he visualized Ariel and himself speaking disease all over Rockcliffe Station, where they had crash-landed after escaping the prior Animus. Any human who subsequently entered the station might contract the disease. "Perhaps, but don't worry about it. Any pneumonic plague is misnamed. It wasn't a true plague. It's not infectious at all, and only minimally contagious. You have to exchange actual body fluids. It's commonly passed through sexual intercourse or in contaminated blood supplies, and occasionally by poorly sterilized hypodermics out on the settler worlds where they have to reuse their needles." That was a relief, but it left a puzzle. How had Derek been exposed to the virus, if not from breathing the air around Ariel? Had he had it before he met her on Artemis's ship? He must have. How else had he lost his memory? But then, how had he survived? If any pneumonic plague only affected the memory after passing the blood-brain barrier, and among spacers was invariably fatal when it did. Again he had missed something. "I said your wife is almost certainly going to live. Here, catch him." Derek, who didn't know who did what, his vision had momentarily blanked. When the light came back he was sitting and there was a tingle in his arm. A stimulant spray, he thought vaguely. They were offering a glass of orange juice to him. Perfectly normal orange juice, just like the oranges of Aurora. He wondered how much it cost to ship it here, then realized they must have brought orange tree seedlings sometime in the past and raised their own. "Thank you," he whispered. They stood around and watched him intently. "Is there something?" "Yes," said Dr. Lee reluctantly. "I hope you're up to this. It may upset you." Derek took another swallow of the juice, marveling again that it could be so exactly like our orange juice. "I'm braced," he said. "Go ahead." "And the pneumonic plague is well named, though it's no plague. Your wife is losing her memory, and at a progressive rate. By the time we've cured her, there won't be much of it left." Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was a very cheery end to your February. All right. Hope you have a good week. Bye.